Is in false passage. There is a particular discipline required of analysts who work refugee and migration signals. A discipline that most other areas of NSA Cyber collection do not demand in quite the same way. The discipline is this: the people whose communications pass through migration-related infrastructure are, overwhelmingly, exactly what they appear to be. They are people in motion. People who have left places that became impossible to stay in and are attempting to reach places that might be survivable. The signals they generate, the calls to family members, the messages to smugglers, the coordination with aid organizations, are the signals of human desperation and human hope. They are not, as a rule, the signals of operational deception. The discipline the analyst must maintain is the ability to recognize the exception without allowing the rule to create a blind spot. Because the exception exists. And the exception, when it moves through the same infrastructure as the overwhelming majority, uses that majority as cover in ways that are deliberate, systematic, and patient. The exception that NSA Cyber identified in the late summer of a recent year did not announce itself as exceptional. It looked on initial collection review like a cluster of communications consistent with a mid-sized migrant facilitation network operating across the Turkey-to-Western-Hemisphere pipeline that had been an active smuggling route for several years. Encrypted messaging app traffic, satellite phone coordination, cellular contacts between individuals at transit waypoints across multiple countries. The surface profile of the communications cluster matched known facilitation network patterns well enough that the automated flagging system initially rated it as a low-priority anomaly. A possible new facilitation actor in a known operational corridor worth logging and monitoring, but not urgently requiring dedicated analytical resources. What moved it from low priority to dedicated investigation was a single data point that emerged 3 weeks after the initial flag. A satellite phone handset within the communications cluster made contact with an infrastructure node that NSA Cyber's existing collection holdings had associated through prior analytical work with Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force external communications architecture. The contact was brief, 11 seconds, consistent with an automated check-in signal rather than a voice communication. And it was the only contact between the cluster and the IRGC associated node that the collection systems had logged in the 3 weeks of monitoring. But 11 seconds of contact with IRGC external communications architecture is not a data point that gets filed and forgotten. It is a data point that gets escalated. NSA Cyber assigned a dedicated team to what was designated internally as the False Passage Investigation. The team began with a complete reconstruction of the communications cluster. Every handset, every contact, every signal path that could be associated with the flagged network. The reconstruction took 4 weeks and produced a preliminary map of an organization that was larger and more structurally sophisticated than the initial low-priority flag had suggested. The network comprised, at the point of preliminary mapping, communications nodes in Turkey, Lebanon, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, and Canada. The Turkish and Lebanese nodes appeared to be the operational origin points, the locations where individuals entering the network first made contact with its facilitation infrastructure. The Ecuador and Colombia nodes appeared to function as Western Hemisphere reception and transit coordination points. The Mexico node appeared to handle the final stage movement toward the US and Canadian borders. The Canadian node, whose presence in the network structure was, at the preliminary mapping stage, the most analytically significant finding, appeared to function not as a transit point but as a destination coordination hub, handling communications with individuals who had already successfully entered Canadian territory. The preliminary map raised more questions than it answered. The network's geographic footprint was consistent with a sophisticated migrant facilitation operation. But the Canadian destination hub and the single IRGC associated contact were inconsistent with purely commercial smuggling motivations. Commercial facilitation networks move people for payment. Their communications architecture reflects that commercial logic. Coordination focused on movement, payment confirmation, delivery verification. The preliminary map of the false passage network showed communication patterns that did not fit that template cleanly. The contacts between the Turkish and Lebanese origin nodes and the individuals entering the network showed less of the payment negotiation and logistics coordination characteristic of commercial facilitation, and more of the identity verification, document preparation, and cover story coordination characteristic of operational preparation. NSA Cyber's cryptographic resources were allocated to the network's encrypted communication layers. The messaging app traffic, the highest volume layer of the network's communications, was addressed first and yielded decoded content within 10 weeks through exploitation of a vulnerability in the app's implementation that the technical team had previously identified in other collection operations. The satellite phone layer took an additional 3 months. A third layer, lower traffic encrypted data transmissions between the Turkish origin node and the Canadian destination hub that the team assessed as the network's command and coordination channel, required 5 months of sustained cryptographic effort. When all 3 layers were decoded and the historical traffic across all channels was available for integrated analysis, the picture that assembled itself was the one the 11-second IRGC contact had suggested, and the preliminary map had begun to outline. The false passage network was not a commercial migrant facilitation operation that happened to have a contact with Iranian state infrastructure. It was an Iranian state-directed operational program, constructed and managed to move specific individuals from Iranian state-connected origin points through a migration cover pathway into the United States and Canada, using the genuine refugee and migration flows of the Turkish-to-Western-Hemisphere corridor as camouflage for a program of deliberate documented agent insertion. The decoded communications, spanning 23 months of historical traffic across the 3 channel layers, documented the program's architecture with a level of operational specificity that left no analytical ambiguity about its nature or direction. The program operated in 2 distinct streams that shared infrastructure but served different operational purposes. The first stream, which the decoded messages referred to using a term that translated roughly as the general movement, was a genuine facilitation operation, moving individuals who were, by the evidence of their communications, authentic economic migrants and asylum seekers from Turkish and Lebanese transit points through the Western Hemisphere pipeline. This stream was real. Its participants were real people making real journeys under real conditions of desperation. The decoded communications documented their payments, their movements, their fears, and their arrivals. They were not agents. They were cover. Their presence in the network's communications infrastructure gave the network's traffic the authentic signature of a genuine facilitation operation, making the second stream harder to identify even within the decoded communications. Because the second stream used the same channels, the same coordination language, and the same operational infrastructure as the first. The second stream, referred to in decoded messages by a separate designator that the analytical team translated as the directed movement, was the program's operational core. The directed movement handled individuals whose entry into the network was not initiated by their own decision to migrate, but by a selection process managed through the Turkish and Lebanese origin nodes under direction from the network's Iranian state-connected command layer. These individuals were selected, documented, prepared, and inserted into the general movement's infrastructure at points that made their communications indistinguishable to external collection from those of genuine migrants. The decoded messages documented the directed movement's operational history across 23 months, with specificity that gave the analytical team a complete picture of who had been moved, when, through what pathway, and to what destination. 47 individuals had been moved through the directed movement over the 23 months of documented history. Of these 47, 31 had been successfully delivered to their designated destinations. 19 to locations in the United States across 7 cities, and 12 to locations in Canada across 4 cities. 11 were documented as still in transit within the pipeline at various waypoints at the time the decoded communications historical record ended. 5 were documented as having encountered problems during transit. 3 had been detained by authorities at border points during the documented period, and 2 had been turned back at entry points and returned to earlier waypoints in the network. The 31 individuals who had successfully reached their U.S. and Canadian destinations were, according to Decoded Communications, not passive assets awaiting activation. The messages documented active operational management of placed individuals through the Canadian destination hub. Regular check-in protocols, task assignments, reporting requirements, and in several cases, specific operational instructions communicated through the hub's encrypted data channel. The nature of the tasks documented in Decoded Communications varied: surveillance of specific facilities and individuals, network building through contact with community organizations and institutions, document and identity preparation assistance for subsequent directed movement individuals, and in 4 cases documented in the decoded messages with particular operational specificity. Activities that the analytical team assessed as consistent with pre-operational positioning for actions not yet specified in the Decoded Communications record. The Canadian Destination Hub's Decoded Command and Coordination Communications also documented the network's forward planning. A directed movement cohort, a batch of individuals selected and prepared for simultaneous insertion into the pipeline, was documented as being in final preparation stages. The cohort comprised 9 individuals. Their cover documentation had been prepared. Their insertion points into the general movement's infrastructure had been arranged. Their destination cities, 6 in the United States, 3 in Canada, had been assigned. The decoded messages documenting the cohort's final preparation specified an insertion timeline of 16 days from the date of the messages. 16 days before 9 individuals prepared under Iranian state-connected direction would enter a migration pipeline that would deliver them to U.S. and Canadian territory. NSA Cyber escalated the complete intelligence package through priority channels. The FBI's Counterintelligence Division received the full decoded communications record, 23 months of documented directed movement history, the identities and locations of the 31 successfully placed individuals to the extent they could be reconstructed from decoded communications, and the cohort insertion timeline. Within 8 hours of the senior briefing at which the complete analytical picture was presented, the CIA's Counterintelligence and Iran Operations Divisions were read in simultaneously. The Department of Homeland Security's National Security Investigations Unit received the border and entry documentation intelligence. Canada's National Intelligence and Security Establishment was engaged through the Five Eyes intelligence sharing framework with an urgency designation that reflected the timeline's 16-day window and the specific threat to Canadian territory. The intelligence sharing process was managed with particular care given the sensitivity of the source. The 31 successfully placed individuals, people who were, according to Decoded Communications, currently living in American and Canadian cities under prepared cover identities, could not be approached without risking alerting the network's command layer to the communications breach. The 16-day cohort insertion timeline was not actionable without exposing that the network's communications had been compromised, unless the operational response was constructed carefully enough to make the interdictions appear to result from conventional border enforcement rather than signals intelligence. The interagency task force that assembled around the NSA Cyber intelligence had 14 days of planning time before the cohort's insertion was scheduled to begin. The operational plan addressed 3 sequential objectives. The first was the interdiction of the 9-person cohort before they successfully entered U.S. or Canadian territory, using the specific entry point intelligence from decoded communications to position enhanced processing and interdiction capabilities without revealing that those capabilities were signals intelligence-driven. The second was the systematic location and assessment of the 31 individuals already placed in the United States and Canada. An operation that had to be conducted with enough investigative distance from the signal's intelligence source to protect the collection capabilities' continued viability, while still moving fast enough to address the operational risk those individuals represented. The third was the takedown of the network's operational infrastructure. The Turkish and Lebanese origin nodes, the Western Hemisphere transit nodes, and critically the Canadian destination hub. Coordinated to occur after the cohort interdiction and the initial assessment operations had extracted maximum intelligence value from the network's continued activity. The cohort interdiction operations executed on days 12 through 15 of the planning window, as the 9 individuals moved through the pipeline's transit waypoints. Coordination with partner country law enforcement at waypoint locations in Ecuador and Colombia, using cover-protected intelligence, resulted in the identification and detention of 4 cohort members at South American transit points. Enhanced processing operations at U.S. and Canadian border entry points, constructed to appear as routine enforcement intensification, identified 3 additional cohort members at entry points consistent with the specific crossing locations documented in decoded insertion timeline messages. The remaining 2 cohort members were identified after entry through investigative leads developed from the cover documentation intelligence in decoded communications. All 9 cohort members were interdicted. None reached their designated destinations. The parallel investigation into the 31 previously placed individuals in the United States and Canada proceeded over the following 6 weeks as the network's operational infrastructure remained active and unaware of the investigation's scope. Counterintelligence investigators working from the decoded communications destination city information and the identity documentation details extracted from directed movement coordination messages developed investigative leads that located and enabled assessment of 26 of the 31 placed individuals within the 6-week operational window. The remaining 5 were located in the subsequent 4 weeks through continued investigative development. The network's operational infrastructure takedown executed in coordination with Five Eyes partners on a single day. 7 weeks after the cohort interdiction, operations in Turkey, Lebanon, Mexico, and Canada, conducted simultaneously to prevent warning from traveling between nodes, targeted the network's key coordination and management personnel. The Canadian destination hub, located in Toronto and operated under the cover of an immigration consulting business, was raided by Canadian security and law enforcement authorities. Physical materials recovered from the hub included communications equipment, identity documentation preparation materials, files on dozens of individuals who had passed through the directed movement program, and strategic planning documents that extended the analytical picture of the program's history and intentions significantly beyond what the decoded communications alone had established. In Turkey and Lebanon, coordinated operations with partner country authorities targeted the origin node personnel identified in decoded communications. 17 individuals were detained across the 2 countries. In Mexico, the transit coordination node personnel identified through decoded communications were subject to law enforcement action that resulted in 11 detentions. The general movement, the genuine facilitation infrastructure that the directed movement had been using as cover, was referred through appropriate channels to international organizations responsible for migration and asylum processing. The individuals who had been moving through the network as authentic migrants and asylum seekers were processed through legitimate humanitarian channels. Their status as cover for the directed movement program did not change what they were. People who had made difficult journeys for reasons of genuine necessity. The 47 individuals who had been moved through the directed movement over 23 months, 31 placed, 11 in transit at the time of operations, 5 previously encountered by border authorities, represented the documented scope of a program that the Decoded Communications Strategic Planning materials suggested had been intended to scale significantly. The planning documents recovered from the Toronto hub described a program architecture capable of managing simultaneous directed movement cohorts at a rate that would have placed substantially more than 47 individuals in the United States and Canada over the following 2 years. The false passage network had operated for nearly 2 years inside the authentic signal noise of a genuine migration corridor, using real human desperation as the electromagnetic camouflage for a state-directed insertion program. It had been patient, structurally sophisticated, and operationally disciplined. It had moved 47 people through a pipeline that looked from the outside like one of hundreds of commercial facilitation operations active in the same corridor. NSA Cyber's collection systems had flagged it because of 11 seconds of contact with a node in the wrong part of the signal's architecture. 11 seconds that did not belong where they were, attached to a network that had constructed itself to look exactly like what it was not. The discipline that migration signals analysis demands, the ability to recognize the exception without allowing the rule to create a blind spot, had held. The 11 seconds had been noticed. The anomaly had been logged. The team had been assigned. The 3 encryption layers had been broken across 8 months of sustained effort. 23 months of historical traffic had been decoded and analyzed. The cohort of 9 did not reach their destinations. The 31 placed individuals were located. The network's infrastructure was dismantled across 4 countries in a single coordinated day. The false passage closed. The signal that opened it was 11 seconds long. NSA Cyber made those 11 seconds count. This is a fictional dramatization inspired by signal intelligence and cyber operations concepts. No real cases, individuals, specific methods, or NSA operations are depicted. All characters, organizations, operational details, events, and geopolitical scenarios described are entirely fictitious and are used solely for narrative and illustrative purposes.